p.m. and I'm calling the Hamilton Planning Board December 6th, 2002 meeting to order. The meeting is being recorded via audio and video, and members of the public, and I believe Brian Colleran, are appearing via Zoom. So I will begin by taking roll call. So when I call your name, would you please indicate that you're present? So Jonathan Poor.
Present.
Bill Wheaton.
Present.
Emil Dahlquist.
Present.
Beth Herr.
Present.
Rick Mitchell. Richard Boroff.
Present.
Pat Norton.
Present.
And Marnie Crouch, present. Perfect attendance. So the first item on our agenda is a review of the proposed Conservation Commission bylaw. I will begin by thanking Lauren Lynch for preparing materials for our use tonight, and I think her annotated version of the bylaw, which indicates where its various provisions were derived from, was excellent, and I really appreciate that because it enabled me to follow how the bylaw was developed, and as everyone who studied it can understand, you could see how the different pieces were put together. But from my review, it seemed that it was a much improved bylaw from the original bylaw, much more complete. It relied on the model bylaw, which I would think that developers would like to see different towns incorporate many of the provisions of a model bylaw because it promotes uniformity. So if developers are going to be working in different towns, if a model bylaw is the foundation of the town bylaw, it provides a level of certainty that they might not otherwise have if there's a complete mishmash of provisions. So with that said, I would like to hear from Brian Colleran. I know from my own research that I believe it was Rosie Kennedy started the process of amending the town conservation bylaw back in 2019. So it was a long process, but we'll see how it evolves. So Brian, could you make yourself known?
I suppose Brian needs to be promoted. Alex as well.
Kathy Simons
Oh.
also.
Hey, everybody. Is my lighting terrible? That's better lighting.
Hi, Brian. Do you know the members of the planning board?
By reputation, primarily.
Well, it's nice to meet you. I have never met you in person, so welcome, and I hope you can provide more enlightenment than I just did with respect to the genesis of this bylaw and what we hope to accomplish here tonight.
Sure. So I'll give a quick run through the history of things at the moment, and then we'll get into sort of the purpose of this conversation. So as you said, Rosie Kennedy was the initial initiator. Her process was reviewed by town council. Council didn't see any real red flags that I know of. And then that sort of stalled in its own way prior to my time. When I came on, we began with a whole new conservation commission, just about. Virginia's still here, but George has moved on, and so Virginia's the only one left over from before my time. And so what we had was a crew of new commissioners, and we began talking about the bylaw and the regulations and in this conversation, we came to the realization that the regulations on the books were the primary source of all of our guidance. And in consultation with council, we determined / discovered that that was a problem. So we began by going through what we would like within the commission, what we would like to see our bylaw accomplish. And we brought that to the select board this past summer. And the select board looked at it and said, you guys, this is great. I love the work you're putting in. We love what you're doing. However, considering the circumstances that our extant bylaw is like 2.5 pages, and most of the meat of the regulatory scheme for the town is in the regulations, let's just get to square one first. Let's get rid of this liability of the way that your rules and regs and policies and everything relate back to the bylaw, and let's clean that up. So we said, great, good idea, and we attempted to do so. The goal of the bylaw before you and the bylaw that went before the special town meeting was to take current practice and bring it up to current legal standards. And since the special town meeting went the way it did, we felt it would be a good idea to get a little bit more feedback from more parties. We tried over the course of the spring and the summer. We made some attempts at outreach. We made some stronger polls in certain directions than others. And, we basically get a chance to do it again. And so we've got a few goals for tonight. One is just to open-endedly say, do you have any questions? What don't you know? What would you like to know? And we can, pursue those either in conversation now or, a little bit more in-depth research. We can see where this bylaw can better intersect with other boards' ongoing conversations, if you will. Your example of the stormwater bylaw, if we were to do something with our bylaw, is there a way for us to do it that would actually behoove some other aspect of, in this case, the stormwater bylaw? Could we make these things a little more simpatico, as opposed to these siloed creatures? Now, mind you, there's usefulness in being siloed, but that's another story. And so, broadly speaking, that's what we're up to. We wanted to say, hey, we want to hear what you have to say. If you have any concerns, that's great. We'd love to work through them. We'd like to make sure that you understand what we have on the table, both intention behind it and the actual execution. The most straightforward version of that is that from the current bylaw to the proposed bylaw would be, a big difference, from 3 pages to 15 or whatever it is. And it appears to be a significant change in jurisdiction and powers. However, we are aiming to go from current practice to current practice. And with that, Kathy, did I forget anything?
Hi, I'm Kathy Simons. I'm Vice Chair of the Conservation Commission here in Lauren Lynch's absence, and want to thank you for meeting with us very much. I would maybe add for those members present who might be curious about how the Hamilton bylaw, how Hamilton's practice differs from the Wetlands Protection Act. But the practice that we've basically been following since these regulations were put in place in 2005, is that correct?
I think so.
To the best of our understanding, since 2005, without objection, I might add, the ways in which our bylaws protect the wetlands over and above the Wetlands Protection Act include the aura, which is a buffer zone area that's defined in the bylaws, 100 feet around resource areas, and the aura itself is defined as a resource area, as are vernal pools and some smaller ponds and certain freshwater wetlands that are over 1,000 square feet. We ran into a challenge when we presented this bylaw at town meeting from a landowner's attorney around the issue of intermittent streams, which is pretty technical, and I'm going to let Brian, thank God he's here, answer questions about the language around intermittent streams, which is a little bit different in this bylaw than it was in the old regulations. And that's the only place in which, for reasons of simplicity and straightforward clarity, we have altered the language that could have a bit of impact on our jurisdiction. So we caught that. We were advised to reach out to identify which properties might be impacted by that. Brian did an analysis using the mapping software, identified 5 properties that might be impacted. We've drafted a letter that's going to get sent out to those property owners. We are also scheduling a number of public meetings, one at the end of January, one at the beginning of February. Brian's talked to DPW. We met with the select board again. Lauren's going to be meeting with Vicki Massoni, with the Energy Commission. We spoke with FinCom in September. We don't want to get snagged on anything again going forward for approval in April, because there's a lot on the line. We've been advised that we're in a bit of a vulnerable position with regard to our current practice, which has been very successful and quite uncontested. And so we're looking for help, making sure that it is a smooth process this time around. And also in the process, really eagerly welcoming closer partnership with other committees, town committees, and the identification of areas of common interest. Yes, Brian?
Works for me. So would the board or the chair, as the case may be, like to get into that, the semantics of the streams, or do you guys want to sort of go in a different direction?
Well, I did notice that that was, the addition of the word intermittent was added to the model bylaw. So the model bylaw just had streams. It didn't differentiate between intermittent or a perpetual stream. So what was your rationale for that?
Okay, so this is going to make a long story longer, so bear with me. The way the model bylaw is built, they have, I believe there's 8 different spots where you can make minor grammatical changes to have significant legal changes. And that is the one location at the beginning where it says streams. Down at the back page, it says if you just put the word intermittent here, it goes from covering intermittent streams as defined by the Wetland Protection Act to all streams, as defined by the bylaw. So what that means, right, is that, and the reason we made that choice was that on a first look, on a deeper look, I found the exceptions. But on a first look, there were no streams in Hamilton that a change in language would have applied to, that we knew of. right, that we had experience with that, anybody could tell us about. The reason for this is that in the current language of the regulations, the town of Hamilton regulates wetlands of 1,000 square feet or larger. So there's a floor, right? Anything smaller than 1,000 square feet doesn't get regulated unless it is a vernal pool. And again, that is according to the regulations, not according to the bylaw. So what ends up happening is that the streams, the intermittent streams that are up gradient of the most up gradient regulated wetlands do not get regulated. In current practice, intermittent streams that are down gradient, not downhill or downstream, but down gradient is the word that was chosen. Those streams are regulated. That can get, there's a lot of qualifiers in there. The burden is on the applicant to prove that the stream is intermittent. And so in the case of this past year, when the drought started in technically early May, I think, and I think technically it's still going on. If an applicant had come in and said, I have an intermittent stream, I would say, okay, that's great, thank you. I cannot prove that, you cannot prove that. We are disallowed by the state from proving that, so you're just gonna have to wait. And they would still be waiting for their project to go through review if that was an issue at play. Because all of the streams that I had initially looked at and initially found in my initial first look were all down gradient of regulated wetlands, rather than making people go through the rigmarole, it seems simpler to say all streams, right? And then we take away the bills, the fees, the waiting, we cut the paperwork out. On a deeper look, there is one stream to the southern, there's 3 streams actually that are on the southern portion of town, 2 of which basically won't ever engage with development. One's on town land and one is in the middle of conservation land. The other one connects the back of 5 properties on Essex Street. I have never actually been to the stream. There may actually be a regulated wetland back there that would then make it a moot question. Maybe it actually is a regulated waterway. I don't know. I can't say one way or the other. All I know is that according to the geospatial data available, there may or may not be, no, I should say it as, there is a high potential for a stream that would not qualify for regulations under the current regulations that is back there. And so that would be a jurisdictional expansion for 5 properties. The other thing that was brought up, and which is a fair point that no one on the commission was thinking of in our initial go-rounds, was that if we regulate all intermittent streams, then that means basically any channelized depression that runs with water, like if you can think of a spot that just runs on a hillside, but only when it rains, that would become an intermittent stream, technically, if we do it that way. There's arguments to be made for and against that choice. But the motivation was to just simply take away all of the qualifiers and all of the rigmarole and all of the fees that went along with what we knew, where the streams are that we know. So at the risk of chasing my tail and starting over again, I'll pause there and check in. And how'd I do? Did I lose anybody?
Yes, you certainly did. I thought I heard you say there are no perennial streams in Hamilton?
No, just intermittent. I was only referring to the intermittent. There are no down until the deeper look, right? Until I did the deeper look, every stream that was mapped and known in town via the state's geospatial data, and according to what limited experience I and the rest of the commissioners and whoever I spoke to about it, we did not have any non-jurisdictional streams that we could find that we knew of.
Okay,
And
so
so
you have no, hold on, you have no non-jurisdictional, hold on. You have no non-jurisdictional streams, is that right?
As far as we are aware, or as far as we were aware, I did find the one potentially non-jurisdictional stream, but it's only a potential until I get out there or somebody gets out there and confirms that there really are truly no jurisdictional bylaw wetlands on any of those properties.
Okay, so now you've inserted the word intermittent, but it sounds like we have no inventory of what intermittent might be. So these could pop up at any potential time or place in town.
You're both correct and incorrect. It's a finer hair to split than that. But you're right in the sense that we do not know where every single stream is in town that would be considered intermittent, nor is it possible, in my estimation, to do so, because if you move earth, right, like say the Bridge Street lots, if they change the drainage off that hill, then an intermittent stream could be created. Just because something does not exist yet doesn't mean it may not in the future. And intermittent streams are very literally, they're very flashy. Sometimes if they're related to rainfall and what's the word I'm looking for? And top level groundwater, as opposed to the deeper groundwaters that the perennial streams are more engaged with, maybe is the way to phrase it.
Okay, I have a follow-up question. So earlier you said, the vice chair said that you had identified 5 properties where this bylaw may have an impact, yet we don't know where all the intermittent streams are. So I'm not sure how you can say that you've identified the properties where this bylaw will impact property owners when you've got this very broad term, intermittent, that we don't know where they are. So
Right.
to me, it opens a whole can of worms of like a property owner, is going, well, it isn't, I haven't seen it, but when they come before the Conservation Commission, some commissioner could take a very stringent stand and say, well, we believe there is an intermittent stream there. So it seems like you're putting, this is a very big expansion of the commission's authority over wetlands or streams, I should say, that we don't even know exist. And they might exist and they might not exist, but nobody seems to know.
Right, and so this, to the first part of your point, is that based on the resources that are available from the state, the geospatial resources that are public information, right? They're on massmapper.com is where these things are used, and that is a gloriously well-built website. So if you've got any real peculiarities or questions about the geospatial data, that's a great space to go look. So within the data that the state has made available, those are the 5 identified properties. I had to sort of get into the data and poke around a little bit to identify them. On the map, if you were to look, they actually appear as jurisdictional. They don't actually come across on first glance as being non-jurisdictional. It looks like it's perennial stream, the way the mapping displays it, which was part of the initial oversight. Now, to your point about jurisdictional expansion, the volume of streams that may or may not be in town. Right, totally. See your point, agree with your point. Functionally speaking, though, realistically, these things don't, they're not out there in isolation. They are part of the hydrological network. So in the middle of a baseball field, from third base to first base, we won't find a jurisdictional stream going from nowhere to nowhere else. It has to be connected to the rest of the drainage system. I'm sure there's an exception to what I just said. I'm sure somebody can call me on it, but 99.9% of the time, it's going to be draining to something. There's going to be an area that doesn't have enough drainage going on a regular basis, enough groundwater near the top of the topsoil, and it'll show up once in a while. These are the kind of spots that, from a development perspective, to your point, this would be a burden on development and homeowners and landowners and et cetera, right? Like people who want to do something with their land now because Concom says there's something there, now they can't do it. I think that that misunderstands what Concom is trying to do most of the time. And what Concom, to my mind, right, and to the current commissioner's mind, as you said, there might always be a wild card. You can never discount that. What we generally do is help educate people on what is better for their land that they want to happen anyway. Most people don't come in and say, I want to, pave paradise and put up a parking lot, right? Like, that's not what people come to us to do. They want to functionally put a deck on their house. They want to build a home, whatever. And we can help them to not harm the resource areas that they value. The reason they want to put a home there is for the view of the river. They don't want to harm the river. The reason they put something up against the pond is so they can see the heron fishing, not so that they can take away the heron's habitat. And so we end up doing a lot of just sort of basic environmental education. And, generally speaking, people are thrilled to, oh, that's great. Thanks so much. I never would have known. Like, that's a common type of conversation we have. And yes, we have to do it in a regulatory manner, just because it's the nature of the beast. But we're not there to say, no, you may not. We're there to say, how can we help, generally speaking? In the cases where you really do have a resource, right, and they actually want to pave paradise and build the parking lot, well, we have rules and regs that go along with that, too. The state's Wetland Protection Act, you can impact 4,999 square feet of wetland resource area. You can pave it over without triggering Army Corps review. And so functionally, what happens is that the state will allow 5,000 square feet of wetland destruction so long as that wetland impact is accounted for in some other way. Usually that's a replication job where, if they need to put up a bridge or a driveway and pave over some wetland, then they dig out the wetland, make it bigger off to the left or off to the right, somewhere on site. So what that would end up meaning for the purposes of this bylaw and for the purposes of Hamilton is that if somebody had a jurisdictional intermittent stream that we just discovered, we didn't know about, the homeowner didn't know about it, the landowner didn't know about it, we just found it in the course of review, well, then we're going to have a conversation with them to the effect of, well, this land gets wet and water drains right through here. Let's talk about what you want to do with this land and how not to get in the way of the water. Because if you put a house right in the middle of an intermittent stream that's non-jurisdictional, you're going to have a flooded basement on a regular basis, as an easy example. And so helping to prevent damage to private property by engaging with where the water is, as opposed to where you hope it isn't, I think we end up doing a service to the landowner, homeowner, developer in the long run, rather than being a regulatory burden to help them to see risks and manage them that they may not have otherwise been able to engage with.
I guess I'm struggling to understand the overall goal of the presentation is to present. I mean, this is intermittent streams. We spent there's many sections to the proposed changes, and that's just one small area.
Right, but this is a critical one. In the
It
sense
sure
that
is.
it's in a jurisdiction.
It sure is.
But there's many others that we
Right,
could spend a lot of time.
and we'll get to them,
yeah.
because I don't think we're here to, vote one way or the other
No,
on this
right.
conservation bylaw. I think that's up to the citizens of Hamilton at town meeting in its final form. But, this might be an absolutely naive question, but these intermittent streams, wouldn't they almost by definition be in a wetland anyway?
There's a definition number 11 in the proposed bylaw says that the term stream shall mean a body of flowing water, including brooks and creeks, which moves in a channel in the ground due to a hydraulic gradient and which flows within, into, or out of an area subject to protection under the act or bylaw. A portion of a stream may flow through a culvert or beneath a bridge. Such a body of running water which does not flow throughout the year, i.e., which is intermittent, is also considered a stream, unless it is upgradient of all freshwater wetlands.
Right, so there are intermittent streams in town that are jurisdictional regardless of whether we choose the all or the not all. It would be the seeps, the spring, the up gradient, which would be, I'm sure you can think of examples of cliffier, steeper places where you can see, like the leaves move out of the way after it rains, right? Like that kind of thing. And you see the dirt in the road that you don't know where it came from, you look uphill, and there's something that was there that is no longer. Those are not wetlands, right? That is, closer to a waterfall in this example. So an intermittent stream does not necessarily make a wetland. It doesn't have to intersect with one until the water goes downhill far enough. Obviously, then it's going to hit a wetland. So I know I'm getting circular and technical, and I don't want to get deeper than I need to, or you want me to. Maybe it's a better phrase. So do you want to keep going on this? Do you want to digest and come back? How would you like to proceed?
Well, I think maybe we want to digest what you just said about these intermittent streams, but Pat, it seems to me that you have some other questions about other provisions of this bylaw. And I don't want to exclude a continuing discussion of the intermittent streams, but if any members have questions for Brian, I think it's time to go ahead and maybe expand the discussion or whatever your pleasure. So does anyone other than Rick have questions?
I'd like to just ask one follow-up, and then I'll leave it to everybody else. So the distance of 200 feet is not in the existing bylaw, and it becomes a real concern to me as we've determined that we don't know where these intermittent streams are or when they exist, yet we're expanding the bylaw to go to 200 feet, which is, in my mind, it's so difficult to wrap my head around this. This could end up with regulations regulating people's property in ways that we don't even know. You can't even determine what kind of property or the amount of property that is going to be impacted. And this is a de facto taking of land by standards that we don't even define. It's just outrageous in my mind. It's such overreach without clarity of what it's going to do to landowners who currently own property and future development. So it's pretty scary to me. Well, let me see if I can assuage any of that. So the first thing I would say is don't look at the extant bylaw. That bylaw is unhelpful and disconnected from current practice, which is why we're doing this process, why we're engaging with everybody and bringing everybody up to speed. What you should be looking at for comparison's sake is the current regulation. That is how we currently operate, the regulations we currently operate under. The 200-foot is in the current regulations. The 200-foot is the riverfront area. That is under the WPA. So all perennial streams have a 200-foot. Right, but Brian, hold on. Brian, my point is we're now adding the word intermittent. We know where the perennial are, and you can identify those, but you're adding the word intermittent, which changes the scope of this in ways that we can't even determine the impact.
Right, that's the next part. So the thing about the current practice, that's complicated, is to your point about regulatory burden and regulatory burdening. In my experience, it is much more burdensome to the applicant, to the developer, to the homeowner, to spend a year or 6 months or however long it takes, depending on if there's no drought, to actually prove that the stream is intermittent, especially because a lot of intermittent streams flow from a regulatory wetland to a regulatory wetland, and the jurisdictions overlap. The actual jurisdictional expansion in square footage, it's not as big as it sounds. Although, you're right, the problem is that we just don't know, and we can't know, and that is an unanswerable question. The closest answer I could give you would be to look on a map, get to the top of a blue line, then when the blue line fades away, to just sort of imagine the water that drains to where that blue line starts. And those would be where you would find intermittent streams. You wouldn't find them, like I said, going from point A to point B in a playing field or some other, artificially, example, from a parking lot to a parking lot or anything like that. You find them where streams technically begin. And the water to begin a stream has to come from somewhere, and those streams are usually fed into by intermittent streams. But again, right, this is your point, and I agree with it wholeheartedly that we just don't know. Where we disagree is that I find it a higher regulatory burden to make people prove they have an intermittent stream that is jurisdictional or that is not jurisdictional. Because let's just say you have a regulated wetland and you have a stream, an intermittent stream, that goes off property above your regulated wetland. Well, so now you've got to ask your applicant to go onto somebody else's property and go upstream all the way and confirm that nowhere further up in the watershed is there a regulated wetland, because then that potentially unregulated stream, if you find it is down gradient of an otherwise regulated wetland, the whole thing becomes regulated. And just the rigmarole and the bother, it's just making people do a bunch of work that we don't have to make them do, right? And
Brian?
so that's my perspective.
I think you've introduced a couple of really important points. One is that we did not put the word intermittent into the bylaws out of nowhere. Some intermittent streams are regulated under the WPA, under the Watershed Protection Act, and have been regulated under our regulations all this time. And it can be very difficult to know whether an intermittent stream falls into that category of being a regulated stream or not. And and that was part of the quote unquote simplification process. Since we want to wrap this up and move on to other topics, I will say that we are asking the lawyer, our attorney, to go over this very carefully and recommend other language if it seems necessary, because it is not our interest. It's not in our interest to make things more challenging or more restrictive for people. We are also going to be getting, hopefully, feedback from some homeowners whose property may or may not be impacted by this, to give us some real life experience with the issue and how difficult it may or may not be to determine the impact, and feed that to the attorney as well.
I think at this juncture, we should move on, but I understand essentially that the point here is a trade-off, and there's the unknown by adding the intermittent stream in the jurisdictional section, but then to Brian's point, you're actually assisting a landowner in a sense from having to prove a negative, which could be very difficult. So, I get that. But I think that
I want to add one more point to circle back to the first thing you said, Mrs. Sherman. The point of this, right, whether or not we put the word intermittent before all streams, right, we are certainly open to the thing that's going to work for the town, right? We don't have to put the same language. We could excise the word intermittent and stick to our current practice where everything downstream or down gradient, blah, 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 and all of those qualifiers. We could do no intermittent streams at all, technically, right? We could just excise intermittence entirely. And part of this conversation is to say, well, what would be the taste for things? Who wants to do what? If we're going to bring this into the bylaw, you know, if jurisdictional expansion in practice isn't happening, but jurisdictional expansion on paper is happening, gets everyone's attention, nobody likes it, well, then maybe we don't do it. You know, like, we need to listen as well. And my perspective as the agent running the paperwork is obviously one thing, but to those who would be regulated, they might feel it is a taking, right? Whereas to that point, I just wanted to get to there is no taking. We don't take in the sense of prevention of anything, right? We regulate how something happens, not whether it happens. You know, because again, you can destroy 5,000 square feet of wetlands under current state law, and it's just the manner in which the wetland is paved over that matters, not whether or not you can or can't. So the Concom doesn't say no. We simply want it to happen in the cleanest way possible. So the issue of a taking is, from my perspective, right, again, I don't think it's on the table because we don't say no to things. We just ask people, show people, tell people how something should be done, not what they can do.
So does anyone have any additional questions for Brian?
I would just say that it would be useful, Brian, for you to indicate where you're following the state model and where you're deviating from it as we go through all these discussions.
I don't think I could do that verbally. I lose track of myself too quickly. But I thought that Lauren's product that she sent, she had done that. Do you guys not have that copy?
She actually did do that. And in that jurisdictional section, I read that very carefully. And the only difference that I saw from the model and the existing regs was the insertion of the word intermittent. And that would be
Right.
in section 3.
Okay. The other, well, I'll hold that thought. I was going to get into the other things that are different. But yeah, do you guys want to move on, or do you want to stay here a little longer, or what would you like to do?
I think we should move on. I think particularly if you report back to us following your discussions with town council and any landowners that might be affected by this. So it's not something that we can resolve here tonight, but it is an issue that is certainly, I think, of some concern, at least to Rick. So does anyone else have anything else?
Yes. On the page, well, it's section 7B, resource area alteration and replication. Second paragraph, the commission may require a wildlife habitat study of the project area to be paid for by the applicant whenever deemed appropriate, regardless of the type of resource area or the amount or type of alteration proposed. Again, I'm concerned about the breadth, width, and depth that this wording gives the commission incredibly broad authority, especially when you use the word whenever it deems appropriate. Now, I understand, and I credit everybody who's on the Conservation Commission and Brian, that this is done with a good intent, that it's designed to inform homeowners and help them. But I think and I'm especially sensitive to this because we write bylaws and we have to interpret bylaws all the time. And these words live in perpetuity. And while while the current Conservation Commission may be well-intended, this grants overwhelming discretion to the Conservation Commission to require a habitat study. And to do that, that's a 4-season study that's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars. And one commission member or two may decide that they believe that this should be done, either because they actually are well-intended or because they don't like the project and they're doing it to stop it. So I have a real concern about the level of discretion that the board is giving itself in a bylaw. So, you know, again, it sticks in my craw here because I've seen this time and time again where it was well-intended language that gets used in ways that were not intended.
So I don't know if this will make you feel better or worse. That's irrelevant language.
That's good. I like that, Brian.
The state law already gives the Conservation Commission that power, and putting it in the bylaw is trying to be upfront and clear. It's buried in the WPA that wildlife habitat studies are, we can ask for them. The WPA protects wildlife habitat rather than wildlife or any particular spot. It just is this broad, all-encompassing wildlife habitat. And so wildlife habitat studies are what is required by the WPA if wildlife habitat would be impacted, because habitat is one of the values protected by the WPA. So like putting in the bylaw is just copy pasting and, you know, reframing, rephrasing. But if it was not in the bylaw, it wouldn't change that particular power of the commission.
So I think WTA is Wetlands Protection, well, I'm sorry, what was that?
Yes, so the Wetlands Protection Act, the WPA, yeah.
PA, sorry. So that language was in the regulations?
No, that is, well, yeah. It's done so in a kind of disjoint way. And, you know, you can be surprised by that if you're simply going by the WPA. Putting it in the bylaw is just trying to say, guys, we know we can do this. We've rephrased it so that you know we can do it too. If in your case, you actually read the thing, right? So now you know. If you had, the WPA is much longer and much harder to read, and that power isn't really as clearly communicated.
No,
So again, I don't know if you feel better or worse, but that we are not granting ourselves that power in this document. We're just rephrasing an existing state read.
well, no, I appreciate
I would say,
your...
though, that I hear that the language sounds threatening and may give the impression that the Conservation Commission intends to use its power under state regs to do this in a way that we don't intend it to be understood. And we can take it on advisement to look at that language. But Brian is absolutely right that, and I think the language we took directly from the model bylaw, which is an explicit presentation of our powers under the Wetland Protection Act.
Yeah, that would be helpful because as a non-expert, I don't know the difference between the Wetlands Protection Act and this bylaw. So I'm really reading it for the first time, but that sticks out as a significant power that's being granted. It may already exist. If it does, then, you know, it's not a problem because it's there. But if you're adopting this from the regulations and putting it there for clarity, I understand that. That's great. The fact that you did so now allows me to read it and express my concern. If it's discretionary, you might want to think about rewording that. If it, you know, to something, get rid of whenever, because that's so open-ended to say something where the preponderance of evidence suggests that it's necessary, or some kind of qualifier that requires the reader, future conservation commissions, to justify taking this action. Because it is a significant impact. If you deem it necessary, that means the homeowner or property owner has to engage in a very expensive 1-year study of that property. So I'm not saying you shouldn't have that authority, but I'm just saying it should be, you need to demonstrate that there's a significant preponderance of evidence that suggests it's important to happen.
I think what Rick is trying to suggest here might be addressed in the regulations themselves. So language, and I understand his point, whenever it deems appropriate. It's helpful to define that. I think in the Stormwater Handbook, there may be a definition of when certain things are appropriate, but in the regulations, it might be possible to give examples of when it might be appropriate. So it enables people to understand that it's not an arbitrary request that the Conservation Commission could make, but there are circumstances such as that would warrant having that done.
That would be much.
And if that were put in the regulations, the language could remain in the bylaw because it is from the model bylaw.
Yeah, and
What
there's a
else?
lot of, unfortunately, right, the whole bylaw reads as if, somebody's got a ruler and is slapping it in their hand and scolding, an unrepentant child. The language isn't built for kindness, that's for sure.
I do have other comments.
Oh, geez. Well, we're almost an hour in, so,
I only have 2 more.
okay. I want other people to have their say as well.
Oh, yeah, go
and
ahead.
and we have other things on the agenda, but you clearly have dug into this quite deeply, so why don't you make your points?
Okay, section, it's F. Yeah, I guess it's section F, vernal pools.
What page are you on, Rick?
Well, it's
Page, 9?
of the 11, 16, 22, I'm on page 9.
Right. And this is from the model bylaw.
Okay. So you're adopting the model bylaw language in section F.
Yeah, and to give a quick crash course in vernal pools, vernal pools under state law are only protected if they exist within a resource area, right? And so what that means is that if you have a frog pond out back and it's 750 square feet of water, and that water doesn't flood, it doesn't connect to a stream, it just is relatively speaking, it's a standing puddle, the snow melts into it, it doesn't meet the qualifications for other kinds of resource areas, then there's no protection for that. And vernal pools have an outsized value in ecological systems and wildlife systems across the Commonwealth. And so that outsized value and influence of the thing is why many towns have decided to protect vernal pools as a resource in and of themselves, because frankly, the word is well chosen. They're a resource. The problems and the changes and the regulation of them from a technical standpoint is, again, it is an expansion of jurisdiction. From a functional ecological perspective, it is insufficient. The most denizens of a vernal pool go from 600 feet to like half a mile. And so it's this really big donut around a very tiny puddle sometimes. And so, protecting or regulating the buffer zone around that resource area doesn't mean that the vernal pool won't be heavily impacted or may not survive over the long run. You know, if you put a subdivision around like a donut hole in a donut, you know, the vernal pool is still not going to work out in the long run. So they are the beginnings of protection for a vernal pool. Getting back to what I was saying about the Concom having a lot to do with education and outreach and talking to people about what they have and how to best protect it. So,
Okay, good.
yeah, that's
Just a
the vernal pool.
question, there, in the next sentence, it has the presumption may be overcome by presentation of credible evidence. I think this falls into the category that Marnie was alluding to, and maybe it's in the regulations. Credible evidence is so vague and unspecific as I don't know what that means. Does that mean you need a licensed professional wetlands habitat expert to meet some standards, or is that some credible evidence? Somebody takes a photograph in the spring and says, you know, this is a vernal pool, but there's no no substantiating information. I think you get my point here is if you're trying to be clear, you're trying to educate the public, and it would be helpful if you identified what that meant.
May I respond to that? Several years ago, I have been in the past a member of Audubon, and I did in that capacity for a period of time work for Audubon Sanctuary regarding vernal pools. And it's been a long time, and I don't remember all the details, but a vernal pool has a very specific definition, has very specific characteristics, and it can't be defined, a pool or a body of water can't be defined as vernal without meeting those characteristics. Now, they're not listed here, but it is in biology a very substantive definition.
Right. I think that the term credible is used legally extensively. It really just means that you can't pull someone off the street and have them opine as to whether something
Nah,
is a vernal
you
pool
got-
or
Right,
not.
and perhaps we could take care of it in the regulations by giving an example. But vernal pool is well defined, very clearly defined on page 3 under definitions.
I'm not arguing that it's
Just
not well.
FYI.
I'm not arguing that it isn't well defined. I just want to know what the credible evidence you might be looking at.
I understand. That was your point. It was the other fellow I'm sorry, whose name I'm not sure of,
Richard
who
Bork.
indicated that the vernal pools had clear definitions, and I just wanted to make it very clear that we're aware that vernal pools have clear definitions, and it's spelled out as definition number 12 on page 3.
Good.
You know,
Just
and
one last
furthermore,
question.
The Natural Heritage Program does have a process by which vernal pools are certified, and there is paperwork associated with that. So you, as a backyard homeowner, can go through the steps laid out to certify a vernal pool, or you could hire a professional to do it. So you don't necessarily have to pay people to get involved with that. There are steps. There are enough definitions, you know, as was just outlined. But it would be an easy thing to insert either into the bylaw or the reg, you know, as defined by or as evaluated by, Natural Heritage.
That would be good. That would be good, because that would provide direction to somebody reading it as to what they need to do to substantiate that. And one last question, Section 14 waiver from regulations. Now, I haven't, and maybe it's my fault that I haven't read. Are you rewriting the regulations? Because it seems like a lot of the regulations are being adopted into this bylaw. The current regulations are being brought into this bylaw. So are you rewriting the regulations, or help me understand what's left?
Short answer is yes.
To what?
You're making an accurate observation that the vast majority of the current regulations will be incorporated into the new bylaw, which means there will be very little left behind. There are sections of our current regulation that felt as if they should be regulatory rather than bylaw language. So there are a few sections of, these orphans that didn't get incorporated into the new bylaw. So yes, new regulations will be needed, absolutely. The waiver from regulation is functionally there to account for situations that, we can't figure everything out up front. There may be a situation that comes up where the regulations are inappropriate. And that section is giving the Concom the power to just sort of acknowledge, what the toolkit we have doesn't apply to this job. Ergo, let's not make you go through this. I believe there's 2 or 3 examples given there, such as like public health projects or something similar to that. I forget the details. But that's the reasoning behind that, is that we can't account for everything and we may be wrong. So we're just putting that up front, that if there's a situation where a regulation in the eyes of the commission is inappropriate, then the commission can just say, you know what, don't worry about it.
Yeah, no, I get it. I just wanted to get clarification because it appeared that the regulations were being pretty much adopted into the bylaw, so I didn't know what was left.
Right. No, currently there is very little left. Yes.
Does this word regulation here in section 14 refer to the rules that are contained within this bylaw, or
No.
is it, it's only, and this use of the word waiver from regulations is explicitly referring to our regulations, not anything
Right.
that's contained here. Okay. So it's,
To oversimplify greatly, the bylaw is what you're protecting, and the regulations are how you interpret the bylaw. And that is the core problem, is that the what you're protecting is currently in the regulations, rather than the how to interpret the bylaw being what is in our regulations. And so all of those whats are being shifted to where they belong. And in cases where we need to, we are going to need to work through just what language belongs and how the bylaw will be utilized. Because to Rick's point, this is a two-way street, right? This bylaw and its subsequent regulations are not a top-down managerial regulatory thing from the commission to developers and residents. It is the rule book by which both teams play. And so putting in regulation, something, whatever it may be, is also telling the public what bounds the commission will abide by, how the commission will behave, and what you can expect from your commission. And so if a commissioner were to ask for a wildlife habitat study in the middle of, I don't know, a parking lot or some other, completely ridiculous location, in the spirit of being anti-development, the regulations will say something to the effect of, you can't do that. Don't try it. It's not, that's not the purpose here, right? And so, a lot of the concerns that I hear, both from Rick tonight, right, and anybody else who I've ever spoken to about this, is that the perception is that the Concom is sort of making a power play top-down move, but it's also running in the other direction so that the citizenry can reasonably expect how their board is going to behave and then hold them to their own standards and to their own regs and bylaws.
Does anyone have anything else for Brian at this juncture? So I'm going to exercise my discretion here and take our review of the stormwater management bylaw out of order, just as an accommodation for Brian. Brian, have you had an opportunity to think about our stormwater management bylaw? Unfortunately, you didn't get the memorandum I had with respect to what I discovered about I don't want to sandbag you in any way, but if you have any comments at all about our existing stormwater management bylaw, now is your opportunity to provide the planning board with some of your thoughts. We've been considering amending it, and when I went through the conservation bylaw, it gave me pause because I realized it took you quite a number of years to do the kind of thorough job that you did on the conservation bylaw. So I don't know that we have a quick fix on our stormwater management bylaw. And also, to your point, it really does make sense to have our bylaws work together in harmony and not at cross purposes. And so to obviate any inconsistencies, or it would be really helpful for final products for a conservation bylaw and then a stormwater management bylaw, because they are so interrelated. So I don't know if you've had an opportunity to formulate some thoughts about our stormwater management bylaw.
Yeah, I've got a few points that I think would be useful for you guys to build on. The one would be to put together 3 or 4 very, very long definitions to utilize. So, what do you mean by contiguous, right? Is contiguous right now, or is contiguous, does that have a time frame? If you're going to develop from wooded to developed a parcel over the course of 5 years, and you do it in quarter-acre increments, would that trigger the stormwater review? Would that make it to the acre? Well, it would if you count in 3-year increments, but maybe it wouldn't if you count, in a 5-year increment. So that continuousness would be a thing. A contiguousness would be in a given, let's say 10-acre parcel, if you did quarter-acre stripes where you cleared them, and those stripes were separated by 10 feet, by 100 feet, by 1,000 feet of wooded land, where would that be in regards to this bylaw? And so defining
are you, in a sense,
kind of would be
excuse me.
where my mind would go.
Are you referring to the common plan of development or sale? Because what you just said plays into that.
That is part of it. That is not the entirety of it, but that would be part of it, right? It's saying in any given cookie cutter shape of land, wherever property lines may or may not be drawn, water doesn't care, right? The water will flow downhill regardless of who owns the land that it flows over. And so to be effective at the purpose of the law, I would say you should define these things about timeline, time frame, the size of the cookie cutter that you're using, the potential shapes of the cookie cutter. That would be where my mind would go. The rest of the bylaw is fine. It works. It's just, what is it you're actually trying to accomplish? Because if what you're trying to accomplish is project specific, that's a different answer than if it's hillside specific.
Got it.
And so sort of acknowledging that in the definition and building definitions plastic enough to incorporate a number of scenarios, keeping in mind the purpose you have in that bylaw, again, whether it's sort of hillside specific or project specific. Those are my thoughts on that. Where it would be interesting to get into the weeds about how the stormwater bylaw ties into the wetland bylaw would be, an intermittent stream, right? What happens if an acre of land is cleared, an acre and a half of land is cleared, the stormwater bylaw is triggered, and an intermittent stream appears where previously there had been sheet flow below vegetation? how do you intersect, how do you interact with that kind of scenario? What does the status of a stormwater conveyance mean in bylaw terminology? Would we call that an intermittent stream because it flows sometimes? Would the stormwater bylaw like to call out that, this is not an intermittent stream, nor shall it ever be? Or would the stormwater bylaw like to say this conveyance, even though it is man-made, should be an intermittent stream? And right, like these sorts of things. And I see Alex making faces because I'm burning his brain a little bit saying these things. But like those are the questions where maybe instead of having hanging chads on where a intermittent stream does or does not begin, we could have an explicit relationship. I hope. I don't know, Alex. I see you doing that. Right. That would be the conversation that would be interesting from my perspective, to make sure that we have a clean contiguousness between the bylaws, so that we don't end up creating cross purposes by accident.
Thank you for that, Brian. Did anyone have any questions for Brian with respect to the stormwater management bylaw? So I think let's turn now to our internal discussion of the stormwater management bylaw. And as I said, there's the potential that we need to spend a fair amount of time on this bylaw. Section 4 and Section 12 have some deficiencies, as apparent from what transpired on Bridge Street. And I had occasion to go back and listen to some of the, watch the YouTube videos with respect to some of the hearings that we held with respect to Bridge Street. But in addition to that, I did some research, and Patrick gave you the memorandum that I prepared. It's dated December 5th. So what I discovered with respect to that, and I'll just refresh your recollection, is that the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary sold the 19 acres of property along Bridge Street and a small portion of Miles River Road to Bridge Street Property Distribution Conduit, LLC. And then Distribution Conduit sold the property to SRJM Realty, LLC. And at the present time, SRJM owns lots 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and it even mortgaged those properties to Enterprise Bank and Trust Company on May 19th, 2022. And there have been subsequent conveyances. But with respect to the A&R request, Summit Real Estate Strategies, LLC, filed the A&R request. And when I did my research in the Essex South Registry of Deeds, the only time I could find Summit Real Estate Strategies was with respect to the filing of the plot plan showing the 9 lots. So that was curious. And so the A&R request was submitted to the planning board by an entity outside the chain of title. And I'm curious as to the ramifications of that. Does that, and this is a question for town council. So in the first instance, I would want town council to corroborate my research and make sure that I have not overlooked or omitted or failed to find any conveyances. But that said, assuming I'm right, can an entity outside the chain of title file an A&R request? And if it does so, is it a nullity? I don't know. So I think that with respect to our bylaw, the problem with it, the most obvious problem with it, in my mind, is that we have a provision in the bylaw with respect to a common plan of development or sale. And we have that here. I think it would be almost indisputable that that's what we had. We had one purchaser of the property, and that now there are 9 lots that are being sold, and they're being marketed by the same real estate agency. And in fact, John Murphy has ownership interests in the limited liability companies, SRJM, and also Summit Real Estate Strategies, LLC. I have that in my memo. I may have misspoke. I did look at the Secretary of State's office, but clearly JM is John Murphy. And so when he was before the planning board, John Murphy did refer to a partner. So, but that's beside the point, because Summit Real Estate Strategies, LLC, is outside the chain of title. So I find that very curious, but back to Section 4, there is the reference to the common plan of development and sale, but in Section 12, the enforcement provisions, there's no provision for what happens if there's a disturbance of more than half an acre as part of a common plan of development or sale. It's just silent as to the ramifications of that. So one option for the planning board, and I'm not going to advocate one way or the other, would be to try and do what I'll call a quick fix, and that would be add some definitions and adjust Section 4 applicability to cover a broader variety of circumstances. And Bill has done a draft of a revised Section 4 that Patrick distributed to everyone. So we could amend Section 4 and concomitantly amend Section 12 to provide for more enforcement and go to town meeting with those limited changes. I may actually think that that might not be the wisest choice, only because how many times do you want to go to town meeting? But I'm not ruling it out. I think it's up to the board to make a decision. And also, if the other factor is if you're going to change some sections, you might not realize that you're affecting other sections. And so a full-bore analysis of the bylaw might be warranted. And so those are my thoughts. I really think I would like to know from town council what, if any, effect there is from having the A&R requests by an entity outside the chain of title, and whether or not any type of, for lack of a better word, quick fix could address the situation on Bridge Street, where I think if any of you have driven by, the mounds of dirt it's quite alarming. I mean, it does look like there's the potential for some extreme runoff.
Arnie, you really got two questions going here. One is the prior approval, and was it appropriate given that there was an entity outside the title?
Right, and that's up for town council. I'm not
Right,
going to
so
opine
that's
on that.
one question.
That's one question.
And then the second is, what changes do you want to make to the stormwater bylaw?
Right, and there could be, just changes to 2 sections and
Which
some
are?
definitions. Section 4 applicability.
Right. So that's a pretty easy fix, though. I mean, couldn't we just add language that says, and I'm making this up on the fly, so don't take me literally as I say this, but for contiguous properties of more than 2 lots, or 2 lots or more, the half-acre, owned and under development shall, this section shall apply. And therefore, they would have to comply with the stormwater.
Right, but we would also have to amend Section 12 to provide for an enforcement mechanism
Right,
for
so,
that,
so there's
and some definitions.
right, 4 and 12, it's pretty easy. It's not like rocket science.
Well, that's why I want to hear from everyone.
Right. I mean, this is not rocket science. In fact, I would think that we could direct town council and say, listen, this is the intent, this is the problem, this is the intent. We need verbiage in section 4 that addresses these kinds of multiple lot, even though they're separate, they're under, and we'll figure out the language, whether they're under the same ownership or not, but that they're under development at the same time, that these apply, and then with the enforcement mechanisms.
Let me interject something here. I'm not sure that the stormwater bylaw really should be thought of as a way of regulating development. It should be thought of as a way of preventing stormwater erosion.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Right,
So that if I owned 200 acres over here on a slope, and I wanted to clear 100 of it to, or 5 of it, or 2 of it, just for view. If it was a steeply sloped piece of land, I should have to come in and make sure that that clearing wouldn't create any
Yeah, I think that's what everybody's saying.
any problems. So that, there are various points in the bylaw where it says all activities as part of a common plan of development. No, scrap that. If you're clearing land, period, that is, sloped to some degree, and you're doing a certain amount of clearing, whether it's part of a plan of new lot development or whether you're just, want to clear land, you should come in and have it looked at
I like it.
for stormwater problems.
Sounds good.
And so that's what the provisions I made. I would just take out the words development, because it's just land clearing on steep slopes of any kind for any reason,
Well, I think we would have to
beyond
put-
any size, needs to be looked at.
did you have an opportunity, Bill, to look at the model? Well, it's the stormwater management bylaw ordinance template that Patrick sent around, because it combines both the common plan of development or sale and just references to total disturbances. It reduces the square footage and it adds elements.
I think you want to stay away from common plan of development, that the law should be applicable to any land disturbance.
Well, this.
Clearing,
that's provided.
and so on. It doesn't have to be a new lot, any set of lots managed in any way possible if you're doing any clearing, period.
Well, sometimes the reason.
Of a minimum size and.
Yeah, but the
on a minimum
reason for
slope.
the common plan of development or sale is that it can take place over a period of time. So it could evade, there could be an evasion of enforcement, depending on the time frame. I think that might have been what Brian was getting at.
Well, if you're down to, the suggestions here were 5 and 10,000 square feet of clearing. So if you had a big piece of land, you're saying that you could clear less than 5,000 square feet one year and then clear another less than 5,000 square feet the next year.
Anyhow,
But if
the
we really
model
feel that
bylaw
5,000
is-
square feet is the minimum size to have any impact,
Well,
then
in the
that shouldn't be a
model
problem.
bylaw, it's 20,000 and it's 5,000 for impervious surfaces.
yeah, no, I had minimum slopes for each size.
Yeah,
I
and
think you
this
both
is
are,
slopes
I
as
think you're saying the same thing. You're just expanding the definition to include land clearing on slopes.
Period.
Right. We need to put in the definitions what a slope is, though.
What a slope is, we need to have a definition of, or maybe it's a variable definition, it's a smaller area if the slope is really steep.
Well, I think you ought to keep it simple and just say a slope of X greater than X and anything above.
Right, well, the proposal I had was, more than 5,000 feet if the slope was 25%, or...
Yeah, whatever that, I'm not a civil engineer to know enough, what slope is, but I get your gist. So I think it's applying some technical expertise, technical, in your case, the slope, and then the legal expertise to add the language that incorporates land clearing on a slope and/or part of a common development, so that we've got it covered.
I think the argument to talk about development is if you want to introduce impervious area to this, or surface area. The model code that Marnie was referring to lists a couple that some communities have. This is a Massachusetts annotated code. It's page 10 of 15. And it has that some communities have established a tiered permit program such that requirements for minor land disturbance projects are less burdensome than those for larger land disturbance projects. And then there are some examples that some communities use that sort of fill in a bigger picture on this that sort of covers a lot of bases. I'm not saying we adopt all of them, whatever, but some of them that are included are pretty interesting. One, total cumulative disturbance of land that meets or exceeds 20,000 square feet of area. Two is the total cumulative added impervious surface that meets or exceeds 5,000 square feet. And that brings in development, and that is what stormwater is about. It's flow on impervious surfaces. So that's an important one. Disturbance of volume greater than 1,500 cubic yards. Now, that is what Marty was bringing up with the soil movement positioning out there. There's one on increase in floor area, which I don't think would be applicable in Hamilton, but land disturbance in sloped areas, 15% slope. So anything 15 or greater would be subject to this as well. And then increase imperviousness to greater than 50% of the parcel. Now, that's coverage. So if you find your parcel is going to be paved over 50%, it throws you into the category of having to require a permit for that. So it does bring in the impervious surface, because that could be paving, it could be a building, it could be other things that really contribute. So the real variables are the slope, the imperviousness, and the disturbance on a site. It seems to me those are the variables. And whether we want to comment on any of those would be,
But what if you're just clearing the land?
then there's no,
Flat land?
then there's no
What?
impervious.
Flat land?
No, sloped land, but you're not imposing any...
Well, then it wouldn't, then the impervious wouldn't apply
Right.
to that project, right? But if you're doing a general writing or regulation or bylaw, why wouldn't you include it to include all types of projects?
So you just add and clearance of land over.
But if you're just clearing land
Right, and, well, it's,
and not building anything upon it
right, you need to set that
for the
definition.
moment, okay?
Clearing land of more than half an acre.
Half an acre, okay. But you don't want to make that variable by slope, you're clearing land that's...
No, you include the
Well,
slope.
wait a minute.
It's included.
I'd
If
include
you're
the slope.
clearing land, you're changing the
Water flow.
you're changing everything about the land.
Yeah, that's a given.
Yeah, okay, but then, okay, I'm sorry. It
Question,
sounds like quibbling or something to me.
who and how is the slope determined?
Well,
I know, having worked for surveyors, how it's done, but within the parameters of this process, who would be determining what the slope is? and what would be triggering that, because typically that's not something that we have in our purview.
That would be in an enforcement section, right?
Yeah, well,
That would be in part of the earlier stages, because the landowner needs to
Oh.
ascertain what that slope is before they pursue their permit, I would think.
Right, so wouldn't
No,
it-
I proposed one thing, but that was just as a suggestion, not a definitive thing, that it's
Sure.
the, highest, lowest point in the parcel, on the land being cleared.
No, he's asking, how does that,
How is it determined?
how do we make that happen? So the question is, if you put the standards together, somebody comes, they need to know, does this apply to me, number one?
Right.
So, and then two, how does the enforcement, occur? I would assume when they go to pull a permit, the permit director of permits would know that there's a bylaw about clearing land of greater grade than 15%, or the other definitions that we've described, Emil's described. But the question is, who's responsible for determining that?
Right, because what this really contemplates is the need for a topographic survey as part of the submission to the town.
For a stormwater permit of more than half an acre or a grade of 15%. But it's sort of like a circle.
if there's no project if there's a project to be built there, he's going to do a topo, he has to. If there's no project, if it's just clearing, then he could go under Tier 1 if we're considering that, as a special review. And if it's just clearing, that's another matter then. So-
Well, that's the problem, because if this could happen in the backwoods, and he said, hell, I'm clearing, 2 acres and nobody sees it,
Yeah.
how do you regulate it? And the person has no interest in getting government involved in the process. Well, then it's the neighbors, going, well, this is totally inappropriate, and going.
Well, in a lot of communities, the landowner's responsibility is to determine if there's wetlands on his property.
Well, that's a different story, though.
No, but he's the one responsible for defining what are the constraints on the site.
Oh, understood.
So, that's all.
Understood, but that person may decide, I don't give a,
Right.
I don't give a damn, and I'm going to do whatever I want.
Yeah.
Patrick's going, well, how do we engage?
I mean, we have wetlands maps, maybe we have slopes maps?
Slopes maps.
At whose expense?
That's hard to do.
Do
What
you
you can
think the
do,
assessor's maps are inaccurate? Slopes maps are 10 times more inaccurate.
Yeah.
I think there would be ways, number one, to define how you measure, a steep slope. Number two, there's ways to trigger the need for a survey. There's ways to trigger what the contour intervals on the survey would be. And I noticed in the bylaws, for example, under one condition elsewhere in the bylaws, it says 2-foot intervals, and elsewhere it says 5-foot intervals. And 5-foot intervals are not very granular, not very helpful. So you can dictate what the intervals are, and it's by a licensed surveyor, and then you can just see it. So
Yeah, but-
the building inspector can see it, or the planning director
Yeah.
can see it.
So you're saying that the applicant has to provide that information.
Absolutely. And a survey is the responsible way to start any project.
But what if they don't? Let's say they don't want to pull a permit. And again, this is theoretical.
How does this work with wetlands? How does this work with wetlands now? We have wetlands maps, but there could be areas that are very wet, that are sort of slip by the wayside, and, I mean, it doesn't strike me this is any different.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Same
It's usually up to
issue
the
about
owner.
self-enforcement, or turned in by the neighbors, or an inspector goes out. It's a similar issue.
I mean,
Yeah.
Pat might know this, but, I mean, typically, I guess the owner would be obliged to hire the engineer to go out and define the area.
Yeah, if you tried using GIS mapping or anything you can download off the internet, no one's gonna allow your permit. They're
Yeah.
gonna require you to do a survey. Because like Patrick said, they're inaccurate.
No, it's really going to be it's going to be self-enforcement or neighbors enforcing it, and where those people do it, and it's not viewed by the public on their own property.
It's the permitting authority typically that's gonna,
Yeah.
nobody's gonna get a permit without doing a survey.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
Well, I'm talking about Bill's point of just clearing on their land on a slope greater than 15%. It's not viewable by the public, and they're going, I don't need government approval to do this, I'm just doing it on my land, to hell with everybody else. Well, that may occur.
May occur, yeah.
Yeah.
And it probably will be the real exception, because we don't have that greater land mass that people don't notice something going on.
So maybe
my
that-
point is there's a
that last
solution.
statement makes this whole thing moot.
So I hear Patrick's concern, and I think there's solutions to that.
Well, are the solutions?
The solutions are you need to trigger,
Solutions?
yeah, in the regulations, you'd want to figure out when it triggers a licensed surveyor's contour map, and it should define the intervals of what the contours are.
So now we reach the conundrum, because what was, the conundrum is, it's not that hard to amend Section 4, and it's not that hard to amend Section 12, but then we have to amend the regulations so that there's the trigger for when.
Right.
Yes.
So it becomes all of a sudden a lot more complicated.
Well, right, because you have the law of unintended consequences. But
Exactly.
isn't that what a land use attorney is supposed to be doing? No, but seriously, I mean,
I'm
going to pretend I didn't hear that. Thank you.
why? Why, am I being obtuse?
Alex, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
So could you weigh in on this? I mean, again, what seems simple may not be. And so with your experience and whatnot, it would be interesting to get your perspective. I mean, we have a situation where, depending on your answer to what happened on Bridge Street with the entity who apparently doesn't own the 9 lots, filing the A&R request, what is the ramification of that? But putting that aside, if we were to attempt to amend Section 4 of our bylaw to obviate what happened on Bridge Street from ever happening again, particularly because the slopes of the lots, I think, would exceed 15%. Are we agreed on that? The Bridge Street lots, the slope?
Yeah.
I believe they do in a number
Oh,
of
sure.
places, yes.
Yeah. So if we were to theoretically just try and keep it simple to 2 sections of the bylaw, the spillover, would it be so great that we would really have to look at the bylaw in its entirety and amend the regs at the same time? Or, for lack of a better word, would the quick fix actually work and potentially address what's happened on Bridge Street?
Sure. So, I haven't had a chance to dig into the, the title work you did. I didn't realize that was a sort of specific question that was going to be posed. But, generally speaking, it's our interpretation that the way the bylaw language currently stands is more targeted at sort of, definitive subdivision type developments versus A&R. Now, there are certainly ways that we can change and tweak the language to, I think, prevent this sort of checkerboarding type approach that you may be dealing with here in terms of conveyancing of the lots, in a way to, not have them constitute sort of common development, either based on the timing of when the development occurs or the ownership. I think there are ways that we can add language that, building off of something Brian had mentioned earlier, is, say, if lots are are developed within a certain time frame and in a certain proximity, then they could be considered part of a common plan. But I think the overall goal needs to obviously be to look at the specific lots and say, you know, how much impervious is being created, what are the slopes, how much stormwater is actually going to be leaving the property and entering the town's municipal drain system. And, you know, those are more engineering type questions. So one recommendation I would definitely have is to consider maybe getting a PE involved in coming up with some ideas for the technical side of this. You know, I'm happy to help with the language in terms of ownership issues and timing and proximity of the lots and what constitutes a common plan of development. I can definitely help with all that. But there are some more technical questions here that I think it would definitely benefit the board to have some input from a PE. So, you know, those are just kind of my initial thoughts here, but there are certainly creative solutions we can come up with to address, you know, the specific issue that you've been mentioning, as well as hopefully avoid similar problems in the future.
And there we have it. So,
Well, Alex, I'll ask Patrick to forward you a memorandum that I did. It was dated December 5th. So the planning board members now have it, but I think that you haven't had an opportunity to review it. So as I said at the outset, the first question is, again, after you corroborate my research, whether an entity outside the chain of title can actually file an A&R request. And then assuming the answer, well, it doesn't really matter. Assuming if the answer is no, it may be that we could get the bylaw amended before we had any kind of new application or something along those lines.
yeah, except
So-
in the case that they've been grandfathered under a prior.
No, they withdrew their stormwater management application special.
Well, the guy
I don't
on
think
the,
if they've cleared the land yet, they're grandfathered.
No, why would they be grandfathered?
If they haven't cleared it or graded it.
well, they've cleared many, I don't know how many, 4 or 5 of those lots have been cleared already, right?
Right, and there's about 4 or 5 that haven't been.
But I
Right.
mean, if in fact.
Maybe for those.
If in fact it didn't count, then,
Oh, yeah, that's going to be a lawyer's dream.
it's a lawyer's dream. But, you know, again, the thing that struck me is that with respect to Lot 1, both John Murphy and his lawyer admitted that they cleared more than an acre.
Yeah, yeah. So,
And I was listening to it, you know, the lawyer speak, and I thought, this is circular logic here. I don't, because the disturbance of land included clearing, and he admitted that he cleared more than an acre, and
can I make a suggestion? You and Emil or Bill form a subcommittee. Determine, Emil, you came up with 4 criteria. Bill's come up with a criteria for slopes. You've got the question about legality of whether, you know, they sidestep the regulations because there's not a chain of ownership. And get answers to those and just say, okay, this is what we're going to do. These are the criteria we're going to use for amending the bylaw for land clearance that captures the kinds of things that happen at Bridge Street, and we need an enforcement mechanism
Right.
as well. And then you get an answer to your title, your chain of title. So there's 2 things going on: amendment of the bylaw and the title chain of ownership there, and one will inform the other. You know, it will sort of like, okay, if they screwed up and they weren't a legal entity, then okay, well, what
what are the ramifications?
what
of
are, right, we may not have any because there's no enforcement
that?
mechanism.
Oh, well, right.
So, okay,
Oh,
so,
well, wait, but if it was a nullity in the first place,
Yeah.
you could conceivably fill the hole
right, But you
So when
have,
they came back,
right, but you have to go to town meeting to make that happen, and that's
Right.
not happening until
April
April.
1st.
So, let's get it done. I mean,
Let's see what happens.
I think Bridge Street's kind of like out in la-la land here. We may never be able to circle back and fix.
Oh, no, but I think in terms of overall,
Oh, yeah.
fixing the
Oh, yeah,
bylaw to
no, I
address
get
these
it, I
other
get it.
issues is really important. So that's my point. I mean, regardless of what happens on Bridge Street.
Right.
It's just the impetus for looking at the bylaw more carefully.
Let's get it done.
So,
I think we ought to also add some of the definitions
Oh,
into
absolutely.
this, as well as the
I think
Section
if-
4.
And someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Your colleague Robin is an expert on these things. If there were just two people working informally, could we speak with you about what we're talking about tonight and kind of give you our thinking so that you can work in a specific direction to give us more guidance going forward?
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's a great idea.
I mean, I think there are two issues here. We certainly need engineers to design standards and best practices and so on. But the question would be to make sure that the applicability is tight enough so that people that are doing risky things at least have to come in and get reviewed.
Right.
That's
Patrick's point.
That's what happened on Bridge Street. We don't really know yet what they're actually doing, whether it'll wind up being good or bad or sufficient or insufficient. That's an engineering thing. But they cleverly just escaped. And that's what we don't want to have happen again. We want to make sure that we get them in here and work with them to do something that's good. So the applicability is really the most urgent question, I think.
Oh, and I agree. And I think that we can talk to Alex about that, whoever wants to join with me in this conversation with him. I'm happy to work with anyone on this. But the other thing that Emil found was this checklist for evaluating your stormwater bylaw. And so even if we were to just amend the two sections, I think we should look at this checklist, and
Yeah, some great ideas in that.
there were some really good things on this, and it was updated in May 2019, so it's pretty current, all things considered. So it's worthwhile going through that exercise and looking at what these professionals recommend with respect to stormwater management bylaws.
Well, I'll join you, Marty, if you like, and
Oh, okay, well, thank you.
do some wording.
So now we will get in touch with you, Alex, and try and schedule a time where we could do could you set up a Zoom meeting with the two of us or something along those lines?
Sure, yes, Madam Chair, happy to coordinate that through Patrick, and we'll get that set up. That's not a problem.
Okay, sounds good. And as I said, Patrick will forward you my memo of December 5th, which does contain what I found at the Essex South Registry of Deeds, just so you have that as a baseline, because I know you mentioned a subdivision with respect to the stormwater management bylaw, but really, that bylaw, it doesn't mention subdivisions. I mean, it's applicable to, right as it reads now, it's applicable to all lots in town. I mean, it doesn't have to be part of any kind of plan. So, we've covered that. So now we can, thank you, Alex, for your input on this. We can move on to everyone's favorite topic, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, everyone on the board, and look forward to working with you on this.
Yeah, nice to meet you via Zoom.
Yeah, likewise. Take care.
Bye.
Yep.
Rick, you're up, in a sense. So I don't know if you have anything to tell us, and then if you have anything to tell us, that's great. And then I have a whole bunch of questions, and I'm sure everyone else does too.
Nothing substantive, since the board walked the property, what was it, 2 weeks ago? Since then, there was a meeting of the representatives from Gordon Theological Seminary and the town, just to get an update of where the consultants are. They're evaluating, as we know, various options. Running, they're going to do a base case of what could likely occur there under current zoning, which is 1 acre single-family housing, given the topography, wetlands, how many units could be developed there, and the relative cost benefit of that occurring. And then they're looking at some of the things that people have suggested is, and Pat Norton could actually speak to this because they met with Pat Norton about New England Biolabs or some life sciences company locating there. They're looking at, whether it could be a retreat center, hotel, assisted living, some kind of light assembly, manufacturing. So they're looking at all the alternatives and running them to ground. So nothing substantive. They're still on schedule for delivering a product by the end of January. They think they're going to have their next public meeting probably second week of January. That hasn't been scheduled yet, where they can actually present which will probably be the final draft, or the, probably 80% draft of what they found and what they think viable options are.
Right. So let me make some comments. So I had occasion to watch a portion of the select board's meeting on Monday, and there was a discussion of the seminary and the schedule. Nothing really substantive, but just the schedule. And so I guess the first question I have, if some bylaw change were to be considered at the April 1st town meeting, when would the writing and any accompanying map have to be presented to the board the select board, so that it could get on the warrant? Because town meeting isn't the date. The real date is the date of the warrant.
Right. The warrant typically is published, probably about 6 weeks before town meeting?
6 weeks before, yeah.
But the town warrant can be amended right up until an hour before.
Right. Very often placeholders are inserted early on in the process.
Right. So,
But the more information, the earlier, the better, obviously.
right, so if April 1st, March 1st,
Mid-February.
mid-February, wow. And let's just be realistic here. The planning board is in the dark, or at least,
You're really going to have,
I am.
you're going to have February, you're really going to have like 6 to 7 weeks to craft a bylaw, have public hearing, and decide whether it's ready for prime time or not.
how does everyone feel about meeting once a week?
Well, only if there's alcohol involved.
Well, no, we would have to go to executive session.
Yeah.
We'd have to go to an inebriated session.
Well, let's just be realistic here. If that's the schedule, then I'm just giving everyone a heads up. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to meet more than twice a month.
Who actually is going to draft?
Well, I think that's the excellent question, and if Marnie was, as she said she was watching, I imagine it was the goal setting for the town manager that you were referring to, is because they were asking him that specific question, because they were trying to determine, well, what specific deliverables are you going to be responsible for as a town manager? I don't think they got a clear answer out of him. So I envision this, but I think this is a legitimate question to make sure it actually has. This is sort of like the baton needs to be handed over. The day after that report is publicly delivered, here are the 3 or whatever number of viable options, most viable options we believe are appropriate, that then, God, what's his name?
Jonathan Whitten.
Thank you. Jonathan Whitten, who's already been engaged and has been watching this, and he actually should be really probably starting mid-January when the next public meeting occurs, be involved in that so he knows what's coming, and from then on be ready to propose or give the planning board some templates that said, well, given what I've seen and heard and what the public has expressed, here are some options. You know, whatever that is in terms of what the instrument is. It is an overlay, is it a special permit, is it a by right? I have no idea what that is. And then, okay, so we're going to allow these uses, potentially. Well, under what format? And how do we define that? And what are the criteria by which we measure that, evaluate it, and approve it? I think those are the questions we have in general.
Who is Jonathan Whitman, by the way?
He's the KP, he's the attorney.
Oh, okay.
At KP Law. He's has expertise in these areas. He actually, I
Say
believe,
that again, please?
he has expertise in the area of, I think, form-based codes and
That's one
other
of the
types of zoning law. He also teaches it. Do you remember
Thank
the
you.
university he teaches
I think
at?
at Tufts, I
At
think.
Tufts. So he's very familiar with these things. So I'm going to throw these questions out. They're not directed at you. They're directed generally to the consultants if they happen to be listening, or you want to take the message to them. Hopefully, it's not just to the ether. But in the contract that was signed, there was reference to a base plan. I wonder if that's been completed. And I don't say this to be in any way
No, I get it.
rude. It's just that, given this timeline, we need to be getting as much information as possible
Oh, I
so we
agree.
can synthesize it, because some of these concepts are going to be new to people on the board. So in the scope of work, there was a reference to compiling the information that the consultants obtained from the abutters and then from the workshop that was held. I would like to see that. And then in the scope of work, again, there's references to working drafts. And it would seem to me that some of those working drafts should be completed by now or almost completed by now. So I would really like any of that kind of documentary information to be shared with the board. And then in conjunction with that, I spoke to Emil, and he is, I'll let him speak for himself, but going to undertake some education for the board. And there are so many different ways you can go with a property like this. I mean, there's traditional neighborhood development, which has potential. There are other options like planned unit development, and Emil can discuss all these things. But so those types of developments have taken place. One in Mashpee. I know there was one in Northampton. They've been used throughout Massachusetts, and everything has, some relevance or some interest. And then we also have to think about, how does the development take place? I mean, if there's not a single buyer and it happens over time, how is that staging managed? is the development done via special permit or with other types of developments? There are other mechanisms that Emil can describe better than I, but permit a developer to proceed on a track, and once they go from step to step, they can shorten the approval process. And I think that that's something that may be advisable, and it may actually work for some portion of the site. You know, some portion of the site might be special permit and others would be something else, so.
There's been some discussion of a very different approach to development, which is development by agreement or contract rather than by zoning. And the way this works is you have a zoning category that says something to the effect, I'm being a little bit nonchalant here. You can do anything you want with this land, but it requires a, detailed, careful contract between the developer, the town, and, some boards if necessary.
Right.
But the
That's sort
board
of what
doesn't
they do
approve
in
it.
large cities.
What?
They typically would do that in a large.
It's known as contract zoning, which is verboten.
It's verboten. What does that mean?
Then why,
That means it's not lawful.
Oh,
then why did they discuss it at numerous meetings?
I'm unaware that they did.
yeah, I didn't
Well,
hear
they
them
did.
talking.
It's,
They may not have known that it was illegal.
Oh, well,
would
there
know.
were lawyers and managers and selectmen and consultants.
Yeah,
All
contract
suggesting it.
zoning. If I were in a butter, my hair would be standing on end. To your point.
And that's a way of,
I think that's
yeah,
what,
I may be using the wrong term, but it's essentially that, zoning by agreement, that,
I get it. I think that's a very legitimate question to ask Jonathan Whitten. know.
he was the one that actually, I think,
Yeah, he-
proposed it.
Oh,
But-
this
but
is
if
with,
it's
wait a minute.
contract by agreement,
Wait a minute.
Do
This-
I go to town meeting?
This is with the discussion.
Because you have to, hold
wait a
on.
minute, this is-
Because you have to change your zoning ordinance to allow that kind of arrangement.
This is the discussion you had with Jonathan Whitten.
Well, there was a subcommittee meeting. Just like
Right. No, I understand, but that's, you were appointed to that committee.
Right,
That's what you're referring to.
Right.
yes.
Okay.
And so there's very early on
Yeah.
discussion, but that's an alternative to trying to regulate the land with land use regulations that provide some flexibility and so on and so forth, is you create a zoning category, which is part of the zoning law, but the way the zoning for that category of use works is it requires a development agreement of some form. I'm not enough of a lawyer to know whether Patrick's right, it's not allowed, but, some people who should know were suggesting it at this meeting.
Right. I think that's worthy of
And
discussion.
that, if people felt comfortable with that, that's something that can be, put into play pretty quickly. Now, you may have a political problem going to town meeting and saying, well, we're going to have this new category of zoning, which is, zoning by agreement or zoning by consensus or whatever you want to call it. And,
Yeah.
here are the people that are going to negotiate the agreement on the town.
Yeah, no, I like what you're saying, but I think you're right. Politically, it's probably not viable because there's general distrust of, public
Well,
officials.
that point was made at this meeting too, so.
I mean, it would work.
There's got to be a combination here of predictability and
Right.
Flexibility.
right, and as of right. There has to be
No, I get it.
some kind of combination there.
I get it. It's just, I don't see that happening. I think it would be interesting. I think it could be fun. I think it would work
best with when you have like the Boston Redevelopment Authority or whatever it's called, where you have a serious entity that has the legal authority to negotiate and, you know, and do that kind on behalf of the city, where you have a fully staffed that's doing multi-million-dollar projects and can take 2 or 3 years to negotiate a $100 million project, and the value is enough so the developer is going to wait and go through that process. I don't think that's going to work here.
Yeah, I don't get it either. I don't think it would work. I'm already feeling not good about it.
Assuming, just for the sake of argument, that it is in fact legal, the only way you could get buy-in, I think, is if it was so detailed that the citizens of Hamilton would know with some certainty what that site would look like after it were fully developed.
Yeah.
Because there's so many ramifications. I mean, if you were in a butter and there's some type of large building, light manufacturing with light pollution because it was rated 24/7, if you didn't have certainty as to how that site would appear, you would really be frightened, I think, to give the A-OK. But if it were almost like a form-based code where the public would know precisely what would happen where, it might, assuming it's legal, have some chance of success. And I have been like on Google doing all sorts of, you know, information on this and that and the other, and I never saw contract zoning in Massachusetts, but that's tomorrow morning.
And the problem with this scenario in the Players is that there's been such an incredible level of uncertainty, and that still remains.
Yeah.
And I don't think the consumer will buy it. I don't think the townspeople would buy that kind of process at all, because they have so much trouble with knowing anything that's well-defined. This is not something that's well-defined, and they're going to have even more problems with it. I think every single item that's in this agreement, if you do it that way, is going to be debated ad nauseum, and you'd be lucky to get it done in 2 or 3 to 5 years just to get the contract.
To move back to Marnie's original point, timing. There are a lot of this just shows that how many moving parts there are, and for the board to assist in moving this ahead in a quick and efficient way, I think there needs to be a higher level of communication
Right.
between all parties.
I do too. Bill, I mean, any information you can provide us with respect to that contract zoning, the more the better.
I'm waiting for our next meeting, or our gathering, whatever you want to call it. We haven't had it yet.
So, Pat, any feedback from your meetings with David Gamble and Barry Abramson?
None other than to point out that it seems the state overlay district applies to the property, and we should be looking at that. I mean, I don't think it would take an extensive study.
Pat, can you take your mask off, please?
No, but I can speak louder.
Thank you.
So the estate overlay district seems to apply to the property, given the criteria of what it sets forth, and it just then is talking to what's allowed as new floor area and how you renovate and what's the definitions of how to determine how much new floor area you can construct. But again, I feel like there's already a tool in the bylaw that applies with little work to amend to allow for the types of developments that are being discussed. So that's really...
Is this based on your research?
It's based on my brief knowledge of the bylaw after having read it and its comparison to how the language reads to the Great Estate Bylaw in Ipswich, which is allowed for similar types.
Are you talking about doing a biolab building type there?
No, it doesn't have to be.
Single use, single occupancy?
It doesn't have to necessarily be that,
Really,
but yet,
in that case, it would be it's a special district. I mean, I don't think an overlay would go there, but anyway.
I'm just saying it
Yeah.
does apply.
Yeah.
It does apply with So there is a tool in the current bylaw that allows that land to be developed.
Yeah, I think there are other options we can
Sure,
talk
sure,
about.
there sure are. I'm not saying it's the best one, the only one, or, I'm just saying there's already something in there that could be assessed without having to wait for the study
Yeah.
to be done. But that's really the only point I had. to-
No, I actually looked at that, and I think the issue there is a bit of a lack of flexibility, because
Yeah.
the development occurs in two phases.
Yeah.
The first phase is with respect to the estate building and how that is utilized or expanded, and then any other step is in a second phase. So phase one has to precede phase two. So in a sense, it's not as flexible as,
Right, and it was actually designed that way because the people with great estates made sure that it wouldn't work. And so that's the way it was split up, so it's not a viable, because nobody's going to take that risk and go, well, I'm going to do this, but then I have to come back for another special permit to do that, and I may not.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Rick. What did they do at New England Biolabs? Did they use Ipswich's version of the Great Estates bylaw?
Yeah, both they and Turner Hill did, and it was a phased conditional approval, and there has been subsequent reviews on new applications for new floor area that essentially was allowed at the original permit being established. So a special permit established, it's got multiple phases, and yeah, the applicant has to come back.
Right, they probably did, modification, what do they call it, of the special permit. You know, they had the permit, then it was coming back, well, we'd like to modify that for another use or different building, or, so, how about your meeting with Barry and David Gamble? Any observations?
No, just,
What were they doing?
I guess I was just offering an opportunity to see a property of similar
okay.
size and similar historic building, so it's nothing to comment.
So they were just taking a look.
Yeah,
Oh, so they toured New England Biolabs.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Now, there's a great estate, wow. Have you been back there lately? That estate,
yeah,
New England Biolabs.
about a year ago.
is something
You know,
else.
the other thing I think I would say as an economist on this piece of land, there's this sort of view that, oh, maybe we can build a castle on a mountain on this piece of land, and we're a little town out in the boondocks. Nobody's going to do that. And the land, as it's already existing, has some value. The apartments are worth probably $10 or $15 million, and the old apartments are worth another $5 million. All of the facilities on the hill, there's like 250,000 square feet. That's probably worth, even conservatively, maybe $20 million. So nobody's going to come in and bulldoze everything and build 40 single-family units, which are only $200,000 a lot. They're going to look basically at trying to carve it up into a residential portion and then into a commercial portion.
Right.
And they're going to try and adaptively reuse as much as they can, because there's just too much sunk cost and capital sitting there. And I think, so in the end, I suspect it's not going to look very much different than it does now. You're going to have apartments in the flatlands, and you'll have, they may add a building or two or change the buildings up on top. And, you know, that will, so that, I mean, I don't think the abutters really have a lot to worry about in the sense that there's not going to be a castle in the sky built on the hill. And, but that's just my guess as an economist, that there's too much sunk capital there. In certain places where the location is really, really valuable, then you have no hesitancy about tearing down old buildings and building, you know, something completely different. But this is not a piece of land like that. So I think it'll look pretty much the same way. And if we want to accommodate them, then we have to have a zoning that that allows, several different uses on the property
Yeah.
and provides some flexibility.
That, in a way, kind of simplifies the whole thing in terms of writing a code. So I think that,
Yeah.
I think you're right in your observation there. But,
Well, I'm really interested to see, what type of proposals for the Kerr building and the library would be viable. I mean, obviously, office space is one's first guess, but I mean, with the glut of office space everywhere, that doesn't seem
Yeah, there's actually
like
too much
something-
office space
yeah.
everywhere right now,
Downtown
People are.
Boston.
Well, and they've already had, in theory, although, like, I'll take it with a grain of salt, another educational institution that was interested in buying the entire property.
Yeah, but we don't necessarily want that because
No,
that
we
would.
don't.
That's right. Those are all tax exempt
No, I
organizations.
know, I know. So I'm just saying, that would be a real easy poof, and it's done. Thank you, bye.
Okay, it's 9:18. So I think we're going to continue this discussion to December 20th, and hopefully we will get, do you have one more comment?
I just have a question on the form-based code at the Winthrop. Anything happening with that?
We'll report on that on December 20th.
Okay.
And so,
I have one other question there
sure.
before you go on to that, Rick. I like the idea of narrowing it down to three basic options, and that's going to be determined by the working group. Is there any way the planning board can get and see what all the options are to kind of weigh in, or at least get a view of what all of those considerations are before the narrowing down to the three typologies?
I think there's going to be another meeting, probably, it may be the 19th, where they're going to have, some preliminary data. So if that's available, yes, I'd be happy to supply that.
yeah, I mean, at this juncture, I just can't stress enough that the more information we have, the more up to speed we will be
I
when something lands in our lap.
I get it. I get it.
It's not, these concepts like contract zoning, I'd never heard of that. I'll be candid. Had you ever heard of that?
No. Well, I kind of know in general terms that the BRA would do that kind of stuff, would
Oh, yeah,
negotiate.
no, I think you actually put, a good box around it. It's very, very common for big city development agencies where you have somebody that's been delegated with an
You have the
agency that's been
legal
delegated
authority to do it.
to make the
Oh,
decision.
yeah, the legal authority to do it and the staff.
Yes, right.
I'm going to raise another point. This is not pertinent to this, except for if you're going to have a work group, it may be considered a subcommittee, and it will, if that, Patrick needs to please check on open meeting law on what applies to it.
I think we're informal and they're just two, so we're not.
No such thing.
Well,
That's my point.
Rick and I worked on the flexible.
Make a what?
Rick and I worked on the flexible development bylaw. The two of us just talked back and forth to provide a draft, and that's all we're doing. It's not, we're not making any decisions.
Right, as long as you're not making decisions, you can talk.
I just wanted to make sure.
If it were three, I think would be,
Well,
or four, it would be a problem.
definitely.
Well, actually, you can get together like in a social engagement. You can have everybody there. You just can't talk. You can't make decisions. You can't deliberate, and
Right.
you can't make decisions.
Right.
So,
You're going to have a party.
yeah.
Seriously.
Okay,
I've
so-
seen that kind of thing posted.
So it's 9:22. And so I think I'd like to spend our next meeting exclusively on Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and any potential new business that were to come up. But at this juncture, I think that Emil will be able to really educate us about some of the potential scenarios that could happen up at the seminary. And we might even get more information about contract zoning. So that will be the focus of our meeting, our next meeting. So I know Patrick sent around dates for 2023. I don't know if anybody had any problems with any of those dates.
I'm going to be in Florida on the 17th of January.
Me too.
Can you,
You too? Perfect. We'll have a meeting there.
can you?
Well,
either
then
of
we
you,
should all go.
Can you appear via Zoom or not?
I will have to check with where I'm staying,
Okay.
but I will check that out.
So, Marnie, is that meeting on Monday, December 19th, or is it the 20th?
It's the 20th. It's the 20th.
Okay.
Basically, these dates are set up to be the first and third Tuesday of every month.
My only comment is that 2 of them land on Massachusetts school week vacations. I don't know if anyone else has kids taking those weeks off, but
Well, I,
Totally get it.
no big deal.
June 20th lands on my school vacation. So I know that there, at the select board meeting, there was some indication that if this schedule can't hold with respect to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, that there might be a very special town meeting in June. But that very special town meeting in June, I would hope would not be on June 20th. Because I don't think I can attend from
Where are you going?
Sardinia.
Where are you going?
Sardinia,
Sardinia?
yes,
Italy?
yes.
Whoa, I'm for moving the meeting there. I
Yeah,
got family in Italy.
So I have a question on, in January, if we're going to be getting this report, do we want to have a meeting after we're going to get the report? And right now, it looks like we only have 2 meetings, which is the 3rd and the 17th. So are we going to have that information by the 17th?
I doubt it.
Does that make sense? Just,
well, let's play it by year.
Okay.
Because I think that, as I said, we may have to work harder. We may have to put in some dates here to get the job done.
Just a question for members. What's the potential to meet during the day?
I'm unemployed.
I have a lot of flexibility, but
I know Pat's got a schedule.
If it's Zoom, I can, I mean, just like
Yeah,
scheduling a meeting.
I'm okay with any time.
I'm flexible.
Yep, it's possible.
I like the afternoon better anyway than the evening.
Just thinking of options.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly an option. And so the only other, so we have agreed that it's possible to have some additional meetings, but do we have any information about minutes?
As a matter of fact, in number 4 of your package on the back, we have, I think, 6 or 7 sets of minutes that have been prepared by the company that the town hired. That contract was a $10,000 contract. It's been nearly expended. We haven't been able to get all of our meeting minutes done, but we did get a jump on them. So if people will
are you
take a
looking for
look at
somebody
those.
to do the minutes
That was done.
for us,
No.
or the town's going
This
to do
is
that?
done, yeah.
They
This is
have
the one that was submitted.
expended the amount of money that they had allocated
You did it.
through the year already, so they're gonna have to find some additional appropriation. And we have a person who is interested in working in that capacity. We just don't have the resources to hire her right.
It's unfortunate that they did the minutes for March 15th because I had already done them.
Yeah. I sent them all of the Zoom recordings since the last minute taker. And we have, as I mentioned, part of them prepared in the fashion that the town manager had followed the Attorney General's format.
So, on February 15th, it has me as absent. I wasn't even elected at that point, so just letting you know. And then it says board members present, and then it says committee members absent, so I don't know. I used two different terms.
Well, let's.
I was I'm just saying that for now, because I'm sure we all need to take a look at these.
We need to
more
take a
in-depth.
look at these, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. We haven't voted on anything yet tonight, but I think that if someone were to make a motion,
To
I move we
adjourn?
adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn?
oh, no, Emil beat you to it. But you
Well,
can
I
second
thought,
it.
I only heard the part adjourn.
You can second the motion.
Second.
I believe because we're Zoom, we have to take a roll call vote. So when I call your name, please indicate one way or the other whether you assent. You have two choices, assent or assent. Jonathan Poor,
Aye.
Bill Wheaton,
Aye.
Emil Dahlquist,
Aye.
Beth Herr,
Aye.
Rick Mitchell,
Aye.
Richard Boroff,
Aye.
and Marnie Crouch, aye.